Hi, my name is Amy Kossik. I'm going to talk to you today about Reason's model for error, which is also known as the Swiss cheese model. And it is something that a lot of patient safety professionals are very familiar with. But I'm going to start off with a little case study. So in our case study, we have a 54-year-old man. He has a history of diabetes and end-stage renal disease, and he's on hemodialysis and insulin. He had previously been in the emergency room with a foot infection and was discharged on IV antibiotics. But he came back into the hospital with increasing pain and no improvement in his wound. So when the admitting physician went to order his medications, the patient wasn't sure of his insulin dosage. So the admitting physician went to the discharge summary from the previous ER visit and looked at the insulin dosage on the discharge summary. The discharging physician had not used the standardized form for discharge medication reconciliation and instead had written out the medication. And he wrote 4U, as in units, of Novolog insulin. So the admitting physician was looking at the discharge medication list, saw 4U, but read it as 40. So he ordered 40 units of Novolog insulin before meals. The patient was also on a long-acting insulin twice a day. So the order went in, it was never double-checked by a pharmacist, and it became an active order in the patient's chart. The nurse caring for the patient gave the patient his 40 units of short-acting insulin in the morning before breakfast, and then a little bit later gave him his long-acting insulin. A little bit later in the day, she realized that the patient was due for another 40 units of short-acting insulin. She thought that that sounded a little odd, so she called the resident that was on for the patient to confirm the order. The resident said, "Yes, please give it as ordered," so the nurse went ahead and gave it. A little bit later, the patient was in dialysis and became unresponsive and was found to be profoundly hypoglycemic and ended up on a dextrose strip because of the medication error and giving too much insulin. He was only supposed to be getting 4 units of short-acting insulin before meals, and he got 40. So he was profoundly hypoglycemic, and there was definitely some harm caused to the patient. So when you look at Reason's Swiss cheese model of error, it says that in an organization, there are multiple defensive layers to try to prevent patient errors from occurring. Now, these defensive layers can have holes in them. These holes are flaws in the defensive system. So if you have pharmacist checks on all of your medications, and that pharmacist check does not occur, that would be a hole in the system, or in the defensive layer. These holes are constantly opening and closing. It's rare that you'll find a hole that is open and then stays open, but when you do find those holes, it's important to correct them and close them so that we can have as few holes in our defensive layers as possible. Because the Swiss cheese model of error says that when holes in the defensive layers line up, that is when an error can reach the patient. If an error does not get caught at any of the defensive layers, it falls through one of those holes, it'll reach the patient. Now, there are 2 reasons for holes opening up in these layers, and that is active failures or latent conditions, which I'll go through in just a minute. So a little history about Reason's model. It started back in the late 80s to early 90s when Reason was looking at different errors that had occurred, like the Challenger explosion, the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, and the explosion at Chernobyl. He decided that while there may have been a failure right at the point of error, that a lot of times there were underlying organizational conditions that led to those errors occurring. So an error wasn't just one person's mistake, it was multifaceted and there were many different layers to it. So he developed this Swiss cheese model to show that we have all of these defensive layers in place, but it is a failure at all of the defensive layers that led to this error. It's not just one failure. So he called active failures and latent conditions the resident pathogens. Active failures are the unsafe acts that are committed by the people directly involved. So, for example, in Chernobyl, with the explosion, it was the staff at Chernobyl that actively ignored all the safety features and shut them off. And that was what led to the explosion. But the latent conditions are the underlying things within the organization that led to those active failures. So there were some workplace problems and management problems going on at Chernobyl that led to those safety features being bypassed. These latent conditions can be identified and they can be corrected. And that's where safety plans and safety different safety things, that's where you need to focus all of your energy, is on those latent conditions to try to prevent that from happening, because it will decrease the amount of active failures. The problem is that a lot of facilities find these active failures and they just stop their investigation. They don't move on to find the latent conditions or the underlying conditions, which just means that those active failures can occur in the future. So the hypotheses that resulted from these resident pathogens are that the more resident pathogens you have, the more likely an accident will occur. And that makes sense. The more holes in your defensive systems, the more your chances are of having an error hit the patient. Also, the more complex the system, the more pathogens it may have. And that's just because of all of the variables that go into trying to keep patients safe. In a smaller hospital, for example, there are fewer layers and there are fewer things in between the errors and the patients, but usually there's a lot more focus placed on those things, those defensive layers. In a complex system, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of hands in the pot, and things can get missed. But a simple system with poor defenses is definitely more vulnerable than a complex system that has good defenses. So a good defense is still your best medicine. And these pathogens can be identified, but the active errors, that error that happens right at the point of error, those are hard to predict. So that's why you have to look for those latent conditions and try to prevent those. So going back to our case study on our patient, there were a number of errors that occurred that led to that patient getting the wrong dose of insulin and getting harmed. The first error was the discharging physician not using the medication reconciliation form. So that caused him to write out the medication, which then led to error 2, which was writing 4U for 4 units instead of writing it out like it would have been on the form. And then the admitting physician read the 4U wrong as 40, which is why abbreviations like that are not supposed to be used. And then no one questioned this high dose. It went and it got approved and got put on the patient's chart as an order to give, and nobody questioned it except that nurse. And when the nurse questioned it, her concerns were ignored. So those were the active failures, but there are latent conditions that could have led to those failures that need to be investigated and corrected. So some critiques to Reason's Swiss cheese model of error is that it can lead to witch hunts in organizations, and that means that organizations will focus on trying to find these latent conditions, and they're constantly going to be looking for things to go wrong. And that's not necessarily the point of the model. The model is saying that you need to do a full investigation and not just stop at those active errors. It also fails to consider the system as a whole, it looks at that single error pathway instead of looking at the whole system. There are also additional active failures that can be ignored. So the investigation will find the active failure that occurred right at the point, but it won't look at other active failures that may have indirectly contributed to the error. And then some people say that it can be too simplistic and that errors, especially in healthcare, are a lot more dynamic and complex. And these are my references. Thank you all so much for listening.